Alright, so I'm doing this earlier, folks, so you won't get angry with me. We are going to be talking about three concepts: the chloroplast, pigments, and photosystems, and you'll see that these are all very closely connected to one another. Let's start off with the chloroplast. And with the chloroplast, it's an organelle, don't forget. Hold on, let me get rid of that. Okay, it's an organelle. And I'm drawing it, this is within a cell, keep in mind. So I'm not drawing a cell, I'm drawing the actual chloroplast itself. And inside this chloroplast, and I want you to first, oh, what? How did that happen? I want you to not start drawing until I tell you to, because I'm going to be drawing some things and then I need to erase pieces. And if you don't know what I'm going to erase, it's not going to be very helpful to you. Okay, and I'm going to draw a connection here, connection here, and maybe a connection here. Alright, so notice that I'm erasing these areas here in between because this is actually one continuous inner membrane surrounded by an outer membrane. I'm not sure if I can erase these things. I really want to try, but there we go. That's the best I can do. There we go. Alright. And if you were to, this is a pretty lousy drawing that I've made here. Understand that this is, again, three-dimensional. And so we have these two different compartments. We have this compartment, well, actually, let me just label this piece first. The outside surrounding this thing is the cytoplasm. Okay, and then the inner part of this chloroplast, so this is the cytoplasm, this whole thing is the chloroplast, don't forget. The inner part that is here, let me just sort of, this area right in here, okay, this is called the stroma. You saw this today when you guys were putting together that puzzle. And then these funny looking sort of jelly bean-like disks that are connected with tubes make up something called the thylakoid membrane system. Again, this is something that you guys saw today in class, or at least the first time you saw the term. I'm not going to be able to fit system, so I'm going to put system down here. So the thylakoid membrane system is the inner compartment. The stroma is the outer compartment. And the important thing about that is that, don't forget that in order to have chemical reactions occur, you need to have a certain set of conditions. And what this division, having these two different compartments, allows for is two different sets of conditions that can exist between the stroma and the thylakoid membrane system. And you'll see that's going to be vital to our understanding of how to make ATP, which is going to come up in a little bit. Now, what I want us to do with this chloroplast is to actually focus in on one of these funny little disks. And these little funny disks have a specific name. They are called collectively graina, plural. A single one, though, is called a grainum. Or sometimes they're referred to as thylakoid disks, but we're going to call them graina. So I want to focus in on a single grainum, and we're going to blow it up and take a look at it more closely in the next photo. So it's going to look like, or drawing I should say, it's going to look a lot like the chloroplast, but in fact it is not. It's a grainum, so pay attention to that. So here we have our grainum, and don't forget that it attaches to the other graina, so perhaps what I should do is erase part of this to have another grainum, etc., and maybe even understand that this fella down here, the second one here, attaches via another tunnel to a different set, another grainum. But I really want us to focus in on what's going on along the membrane, which is a phospholipid membrane, just like the same phospholipid bilayer that we've seen with all organelles, and including the cell membrane or plasma membrane. But we have stuff happening here. And I'm only going to draw one set of these things, but understand that any single granum is going to have potentially tens of these things. So the first thing, I'm going to have a big green blob. And this big green blob here is a photosystem. And in fact, I'm going to call this one a photosystem 2. Hey, another thing that we're familiar with, right, from today's exercise. And then I'm going to have yet another photosystem, except lo and behold, guess what this one is called? You got it. This is also a photosystem, but it's photosystem 1. Now, photosystem 1 and 2 are named that because photosystem 1 actually evolved before photosystem 2. So by having photosystem 2, it's a more advanced process. We'll talk, well, actually we're not even going to talk about the less advanced form of photosynthesis because that just adds a level of complexity you don't need to know. But anyway, suffice it to say that photosystem 1 was the first to evolve, and then photosystem 2 came after that. But we don't just have photosystems, we also have electron transport systems. And so I'm going to show that with these connected black blobs that follow right after each of these photosystems. Now again, if you go back to the puzzle you guys are working on today, you would understand that after an electron is released from a photosystem, it goes right to an electron transport system, which is why it's so handy for me to have the electron transport system right here following each one of these photosystems. So they're always going to be in tight connection to one another. In fact, you know, the photosystem 2 is going to be there, then the electron transport system following photosystem 2 is always going to be right here, followed by photosystem 1 and another electron transport system. So if I were to have many of these across the surface of a single granum, I'd have another set of these four things hanging out along here, and maybe another one along here, another one here, etc. I think you get the point there. There's another thing that you need to make sure that you include. I'm going to make this one in red. And it's a big old honkin' channel protein that we have going here. So I'm going to leave open the middle part because the channel protein opens up and it actually spans the thylakoid membrane system and the stroma. Don't forget that the stroma is out here, and this is the thylakoid membrane system in here. Let me go ahead and just do some erasing here because I don't want to have that here. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in this a little bit better. So this is a protein channel, and in fact it's a protein channel that also serves as an enzyme because there's a little space right here, a little black blob there. And that blob is one of those active sites, just like enzymes always have these active or activation sites hanging out in it. And this ultimately is going to be an enzyme that creates ATP. And we have a specific name for this enzyme that's a membrane-bound enzyme. It's called Atp Synthase. And you might even hear it be called synthetase in some textbooks. It doesn't really make a difference what you want to call it. Up to you. And again, that's a very important part of any one of these thylakoid disks or granum or grana. Okay, so there you have it. That's the zooming in on the larger chloroplast. So you'd imagine that, you know, if I could draw it in here, I would, but there'd be a little ATP synthase here. You'd perhaps have photosystem here, another photosystem here, and then you'd have a whole bunch of electron transport systems following them, covering all these grana all over the place. Lots of action. So now let's jump forward and understand what a photosystem is. Again, you worked with this, or at least you saw this word, but you guys don't know what photosystems do. Now, photosystems are pretty complex things. I'm going to greatly simplify this because, frankly, you don't need to make it any more complex than is necessary. But at the root of a photosystem is a very important thing called a pigment. And a pigment is a complex molecule. It's an organic molecule, but it has a very important part that's not organic. So if I had a pigment and it looked like this. Okay, it would have carbon backbone and everything, and a carbon chain, and it would look kind of like, I don't know, maybe like a tennis racket. Now, it doesn't really look like a tennis racket, but it's a very important thing to notice that it's bigger at one side and sort of looks like it has a tail coming off of it in this direction right here, right? And right in the middle of this larger, I guess you'd call it a head, is a very important thing. There is an atom in there, and typically that atom is some form of a metal. Now, if you took chemistry last year, you would know that there's one thing that metals can do that a lot of things can't do, and that is that they love to lose electrons. They lose electrons readily, and as a result become a positively charged ion. Okay? So if you lose an electron, what is that? Is that reduction or oxidation? If you don't remember, that is an oxidation reaction where you lose an electron. So this metal is all psyched to be oxidized. The metal is ready to lose an electron. It has a propensity to want to lose an electron. But let's zoom in a little bit on that metal. Let's imagine that the metal looks like this, with a core of protons and neutrons, and it has a whole bunch of electrons floating around. Now, this is sort of cheating, because as you probably know, electrons don't actually cruise around in orbits. Electrons cruise around in what are called orbitals, that aren't these nicely defined round circles that go around the center like it's a planet going around the sun. But for our purposes, it makes it a lot easier to understand it this way. Now, if you go back and really want to get into this, it's all about quantum mechanics, and we're actually moving up and down quantum levels. And these things can be labeled quantum level 1, quantum level 2, etc., etc. But again, this isn't really chemistry, this is biology, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. However, the detail I do want to provide to you is that you can get an electron to go into an excited state. And when you do that, if you put energy into this metal, the electron actually temporarily bumps up and goes up here to a higher energy level. But it doesn't like to be up there. And frankly, basically, just like human beings, they like to settle down and be in a relaxed mode. And in fact, while energy can be given to this electron right here, so that it pumps up to up here, it's only going to be a temporary thing. And eventually, that same electron is going to fall right back down, back to its steady state, or its lower energy state. But when it does that, and this is a really important thing to understand, when it falls back down after being excited, it actually releases a photon of energy. Now, as you guys know, probably from physics, a photon is a packet of energy that is released. And in fact, we want to take advantage of that photon release. So, if we're talking about a pigment here, which has one of these metal centers, just like we have this metal right here, right? This is some metal atom. That means that something is going to be able to excite the electron in this metal, make the electron bump up, and then fall back down. And when it does that, it releases a photon of energy. Well, what is it that makes it get all excited so that electrons go up and then drop down to release energy? The thing that does that? Mr. Sun. So a photon of light from the sun will strike this reaction center of the pigment. Okay, the reaction center, also known as the metal that's hanging out in the middle of that pigment. So the pigments are designed to channel their energy towards this metal hanging out in the reaction center. And when the photons of light get this metal all excited, an electron gets boosted up, electron drops down, and a photon of energy is released. So, what does this have to do with a photosystem? Well, it turns out that a photosystem is simply a whole set of pigments. And what's cool about this is you can think of it almost like a bucket brigade of sorts. And each of these green things that I'm drawing here, while they're pigments, you could think of these pigments as also being like little firemen. And they are carrying buckets of water. And each of the groups that are on the top here, notice that there are more firemen at the top than there are firemen towards the bottom of this photosystem. So this whole thing here, this whole array of pigments, that's a photosystem. And what's important here is that if you have sunlight striking each one of these dudes, okay, or if we're going back to our concept of this being like a bucket brigade, if water is filling each one of those things, and then the water then is transferred to the next line, I want you to notice that this group right here has fewer pigments than this group right here. So that means each one of these groups, as a collective group, there's going to be more water per pigment, or more in the case of this. If we let's go back and return to our not the metaphor, but the original intent of what pigments do. There are more photons, okay, more photons of energy are going to be then transferred to a smaller number of pigments. So that means each one of the pigments that we see in this row will collectively receive the energy associated with the electron bumping up and bumping back down and releasing energy to this row. So this row of pigments will receive more energy per pigment than this row. And this row right here will receive then more energy per pigment. This will receive more energy. And what you can see here is it starts to concentrate all those photons from each one of those pigments until this last dude right here that I'm circling up in black receives all the photons that have been transferred from all the pigments above it. And as a result of that, there's so much energy associated with this pigment. Don't forget, the pigment looks just like this thing right here. All right? So much energy hits the reaction center of that pigment that we don't just have an electron that boosts up temporarily and then drops back down to release a photon of light. In fact, we have enough energy that the electron shoots off. And that electron, because it has so much energy associated with it, being released from that the metal, it releases itself as a high energy electron. High energy electrons released. And that high energy electron, the He, can actually do work in an electron transport system. So there you go. There we have a whole bunch of pigments hanging out in a photosystem. We understand now where all the energy comes from to release that electron in the first place. We understand that electron will then cruise through this electron transport system, and it'll lower its energy, have to go into the next photosystem, boost its energy again through the energy of the sunlight, and go through another electron transport system where more work will take place. And by the way, the name of the pigment that releases the electron at the bottom of the photosystem, in other words, in the case of the photosystem 2, it's P680. Hey, that's a familiar thing. And in the case of photosystem 1, it's called P700. P standing for pigment. And in fact, P680 and P700 are chlorophylls. Chlorophyll is a type of pigment. All right, enough of that. I'm almost gone to 20 minutes. I know how much you guys hate these things taking so long, so I'm going to stop here, and I will see you tomorrow.